If you've ever believed that darkness can be merciful, that some monsters were crowns not because they crave blood, but because they understand loss, then you'll want to stay until the end of this tale. And if you believe that sometimes even a creature of night can choose kindness over power, then go ahead. Like, share, and subscribe, because this story will prove you right in ways you won't forget. The first time I saw her, the rain was falling sideways, thick, icy shards that turned the marble courtyard of the vampire citadel into a mirror of black glass. The gates had been sealed for nearly 100 years, bound by old magic and older grudges. No mortal had crossed them in my lifetime, and yet, just before midnight, the sound came, a thunderous, hollow boom, followed by a shriek so raw it sliced through the storm. The guards stirred first, their armor whispering against the silence, and I, ever the chronicler of the king's long and merciless reign, followed as they gathered in the great hall. None of us were prepared for what the wind carried in. A child, human and shaking, no higher than my waist, her bare feet cut open on the stone, her face streaked with mud and tears that glowed faintly under the torchlight. She looked so out of place among us, this fragile, mortal thing surrounded by creatures who could break her in half with a sigh. And yet, she didn't cower. Her small fists beat against the air as she stumbled forward, sobbing, "They took my brother. Please, please help him." I remember how her voice echoed up into the vaulted ceiling like a prayer and a curse all at once. The guards tensed, expecting their king to order her removal. Vampires don't take kindly to uninvited guests, much less living ones. But something in the air shifted. The flames dimmed, the shadows bent, and from the darkness above the throne, he appeared. King Kale of the Crimson Dominion was not the kind of ruler mortals imagined from their frightened bedtime stories. He was worse, and infinitely more compelling. Tall as judgment, his hair dark as the abyss, and his eyes that burned not red but the deep, wounded color of old wine. When he spoke, it wasn't a question, it was command woven into sound. "Who dares breach my gates?" he asked, his voice so calm it frightened even me. The girl, drenched and trembling, lifted her chin and said through tears, "My name is Alara. My mama said, you owe her a favor." You could have heard a pin drop in that hall. Even the storm outside seemed to falter, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. Owe her a favor. To a vampire king, those were words sharper than any blade. Kale's expression didn't change, but the color drained from the room, as if the shadows themselves remembered what he had tried to forget. "Your mother's name." Lightning flashed through the stained glass windows, and for an instant, I thought I saw it. The monster inside the king stir, ancient and wrathful. He rose, his cloak unfurling behind him like wings, and when he turned to his court, his voice shook the very foundations of the citadel. "Ready the shadow riders," he commanded. "We leave before dawn." "Your Majesty," cried one of the advisors, pale as ash. "She's a human child. You would risk the covenant for one mortal life." Kale's gaze cut through him like a blade. "No," he said, "not for one mortal life. For a promise." He looked back at the girl, who stood so small, clutching her tattered hem. "And because if we do not answer her cry," he continued, his voice lowering to a growl, "then we have become the very monsters they name us." The hall erupted into whispers as he swept the child into his arms and carried her from the throne room, the torches dimming in his wake. I followed, because that is what I do. I follow history as it unfolds, even when it threatens to devour me. And as the storm closed around the citadel once more, I knew that something ancient had awakened that night. The king who had sworn never again to walk the mortal world was going to war for a promise written in blood. And though I didn't yet understand it, the child's cry had done what centuries of rebellion could not. It made the vampire king remember his heart. The world felt thinner that night, as if the veil between realms had worn away and something ancient pressed against it from the other side. I trailed behind the king and his riders, keeping close enough to see but far enough to avoid his notice. Or perhaps he let me follow. The truth is, Kale always knew when he was being watched. He allowed it only when he wanted his story told. And this, I could tell, would be one worth remembering. The storm had passed, but the air still smelled of thunder and wet earth. Lightning flickered beyond the tree line like dying veins of light as our horses cut through the darkness. The human girl, Alara, rode before the vampire king himself, wrapped in his cloak that hung on her like night-made cloth. Her small hands gripped the reins, her chin pressed to his armor, and every now and then, I caught her whispering to herself. Names, prayers, maybe both. Behind them, the vampire knights rode silent, their eyes burning like coals. None of us had ever seen the king so human. The forest we entered was called the Hollow Woods, though few dared to name it aloud. It was a place that even vampires avoided when the moon was high. The trees there were older than the citadel itself, bent and black and slick with centuries of forgotten rain. The ground pulsed faintly, veins of crimson moss glowing between the roots, and the mist hung thick enough to smother the sound of hoofbeats. I remember one of the riders whispering a prayer in the old tom, the kind used before the First War. He stopped when Kale raised a hand. "Do not speak their names here," the king warned softly. "The dead remember more than we do." After an hour's ride, we reached a clearing shaped like a scar. There, Kale dismounted and lifted Alara down. "Rest," he told her, his voice gentler than I had ever heard it. She tried to speak, but exhaustion claimed her. She curled up near the fire one of the knights had kindled and fell asleep almost instantly, her face streaked with dirt, but peaceful at last. Kale stood over her for a long time before turning to me. "If I do not return," he said, "you will take her to the monastery at Dor." "The one the priests abandoned?" I asked. His eyes flicked toward the horizon, glowing faintly red. "Not abandoned. Guard it. Tell them the blood debt has been invoked." I didn't dare ask more. The words carried weight, ancient, binding weight. Then, with a breath, Kale extended one hand. The shadows around us stirred like living things. His form blurred, edges dissolving into smoke, his cloak turning to black wings that unfurled silently. "The men who took the boy are close," he said. "They think me trapped by my own laws. They've forgotten what I was before I wore this crown." And then he vanished. The forest swallowed him whole. Hours passed, or minutes. Time moves differently when fear lives in your bones. The fire cracked softly, casting red across Alara's sleeping face. I almost thought he'd left us for good when the forest erupted with sound. Steel clashing, the hiss of silver, and then a roar that wasn't human. The trees themselves seemed to bend away from it. The girl bolted upright. "Is that him?" she cried. "Yes," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was comforting her or myself. That's the sound of a promise keeping itself. When Kale returned, the horizon was gray with false dawn. His armor steamed, streaked with blood and ash, and his hands, those terrible, elegant hands, held a small boy limp but breathing. Alara screamed her brother's name and ran to him, throwing herself into his arms. The king knelt, lowering the boy gently to the earth. "He lives," Kale said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "They tried to turn him into bait. He fought until the end." The girl's sobs filled the clearing. She clung to her brother, whispering over and over that she'd never let him go again. I think it was then the king finally looked away. His gaze swept the tree line, where the mist had turned a sickly red. "The inquisitors were not alone," he murmured. "They spoke of a greater master, one who remembers the old blood. An enemy of the crown?" I asked quietly. His eyes met mine, and for a heartbeat, I saw something flicker there. Not fear, but recognition. "No," he said. "An enemy of the world." The dawn broke at last, faint and pale, painting the black trees gold. Kale rose, his cloak still smoking from battle, and for a moment, he looked like something torn between heaven and hell. "Take them back to the citadel," he ordered. "The child will recover. The girl stays with her brother. No one touches them." I hesitated. "And you, my king?" Kale turned toward the rising sun, and I swear the light bent around him like it was afraid to touch him. "I have debts to settle," he said quietly, "and promises that burn too deep to forget." With that, he stepped into the morning, a shadow crossing the first light of day. A vampire who had once sworn never to see the sun again, now walking straight toward it. And though none of us said it aloud, we all understood. The real hunt had just begun. By the time we returned to the citadel, dawn had turned the sky into pale fire. The gates, iron, ancient, and bound by runes no mortal hand could forge, groaned open at the king's approach. The guards, usually proud and unflinching, stepped aside with their eyes lowered. None dared meet his gaze, not when the scent of battle and blood still clung to him like smoke. In his arms he carried the boy, small, pale, trembling, but alive. Behind him, little Alara walked barefoot through puddles of dawnlight, her brother's name whispered over and over like a prayer she refused to let die. I followed, silent, the witness to what would later be called the Night of the Broken Covenant. The grand hall was empty. The torches guttered as the king passed, their flames bowing in deference. He didn't stop until he reached the inner sanctum, the chamber reserved for oaths, where even the eldest vampires feared to tread. The walls there breathed faint light from veins of crimson stone, and the air itself thrummed with sleeping power. Kale laid the boy upon the marble altar at the center of the room. "He bleeds because I hesitated," he said quietly, almost to himself. "A child should never bear the weight of our old sins." He drew his dagger, obsidian hilt, silvered edge, and cut across his palm. The blood that fell was thick and dark, burning faintly as it struck the altar. The veins of stone flared alive beneath it, pulsing outward in a web of scarlet light that climbed the walls and wrapped the chamber in an eerie glow. "By the blood that binds, by the promise once given," he intoned, his voice deep enough to shake the foundation. "I renew the oath of Hollowbrook. No child of that name shall be taken, hunted, or harmed while my line endures. My blood for their peace, my shadow for their dawn." The light answered him. It rose in spirals of fire and mist, coiling above the altar like living smoke. When it fell back, the boy gasped, a shuddering, fragile sound, and his eyes fluttered open. "Eloch," Alara cried, rushing forward. She clutched him so tightly he winced, and then both began to laugh and sob in the same breath. I felt something strange stir in my chest, something I hadn't felt in years. Hope, perhaps. Or maybe it was disbelief. The king watched them for a moment longer, then turned away, his expression unreadable. "It is done," he said softly. "The pact sleeps again." His hands still bled, dripping into the cracks of the stone. When he finally clenched his fist, the wound sealed instantly, but the mark of the oath burned faintly beneath his skin, glowing through the glove like an ember refusing to die. Outside, the sun had crested the mountains, painting the fortress in gold. The air smelled of rain and iron, of endings and beginnings. I followed him to the high balcony, where the wind tugged at his cloak, still torn from battle. Below us, the valley stretched wide and green, the morning mist rolling like waves. He stood in silence for a long while, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the horizon, as if searching for the woman whose name had summoned him back to mercy. "Will you rest now, my king?" I asked finally. He didn't turn to me when he answered. "Rest." His voice was quieter now, the fury gone, leaving only something tired and human. "No, there's no rest for those who break and mend their own hearts in the same breath." He looked down at his hand, the faint glow beneath the skin fading slowly. "But there is peace, perhaps. For them, at least." Below, I saw the girl and her brother standing in the courtyard, the morning light gilding their hair. She was laughing now, holding his hand as he took uncertain steps. For the first time, the sound of a child's laughter filled the vampire citadel, a sound older than hate, brighter than blood. Kale turned from the sunrise, retreating back into the shadows that clung to him like old friends. "Tell their story," he said as he passed me. "Make them remember that we are not only made of hunger." And so I have. Because that morning, when the sun rose over the blood-stained stones and the ancient vow renewed itself in light, the vampire king reminded the world that even creatures born in darkness can choose to keep a promise. And for the first time in 1,000 years, the citadel did not feel like a tomb. It felt, against all reason, alive.